Great. So hello, everyone. I'm Bianca. I'm a lecturer at the University of West of Scotland. My first laterality, North Sea laterality meeting here, so I'm delighted to be here. I am going to be talking very little bit about a very small part of a larger project that I'm currently working on. I had hoped to have more data to present today, but thank you to COVID, the project has been pushed back a year and I have minimal data, as you will see, but I'm hoping to come back in 2 years' time and have a lot more to tell you about. Also, random fun fact, Doreen Kimura is my academic great-grandmother, so take that as you will. So I am going to be talking about the expression of emotion between neurotypical and autistic samples. I was also going to talk about emotion perception, but again, thanks to COVID and the way my tasks are set up, I don't have enough data to show you yet for that. So we're just going to focus on expression, keep it short and sweet. Oh, and I also wanted to mention thank you to my co-investigator, Carrie Ballantyne, and our lovely research assistant, Sarah Gardner, and that's her son in the picture. Both of them have also served as autistic consultants on this project. So one behavioral laterality, I guess, aspect that I find really interesting is this idea of the left cheek bias. So the vast majority of painted portraits from the Middle Ages until today have been found to emphasize the left cheek so that it's facing the viewer. And indeed, this was first identified by McManus and Humphrey in 1973. And there seems to be a lot more research that's coming up again in the last few decades about this left cheek bias. Now, it's not just found in painted portraits, but it's also found, for example, in political portraiture in a study by Thomas and colleagues that Nicholas was also on. Now, I don't think that Nicola Sturgeon was one of their stimuli, but I was delighted to see that Nicola Sturgeon, I chose her because leader of Scotland, I live in Scotland, she was also showing a left cheek bias on her official portrait. And another example, Okubo and colleagues found a left cheek posing bias for jujitsu medalists from jujitsu competitions when they're posing for their photograph to commemorate their win. More often than not, they're turning to emphasize their left cheek. Now, I'll also note briefly that left cheek portraits, so if you are showing portraits to participants, and it's a portrait either showing the left cheek or the right cheek, or it's a left cheek portrait and then just the same thing, mirror reversed, individuals tend to prefer the left cheek portrait and think that it conveys more emotion than the right cheek portrait. So why the left cheek? Why do we love the left cheek so much? Well, we can eliminate potentially a few possible theories. We think that it's not due to mechanical preferences. So hand preferences, for example, when you're drawing a portrait, maybe the curve of a right-handed arm might prefer to draw a cheek in a certain direction. No, that's been eliminated as potential explanation. It's not due to aesthetic preferences. It's not due to any differences in the big five personality traits. One theory that I quite like and is dominating the literature right now is the idea that maybe it's a side effect of right hemisphere emotion processing. And because the right hemisphere is thought to be dominant, depending on the theory, I suppose, for emotion processing, we therefore also tend to see emotion come out faster and more strongly on the left side of the face. And part of the reason for that is because of the contralateral innervations from our cranial nerve 7, our facial nerve that you can see on the slide here. So if you follow the whoop, that is not the laser pointer. Here we go. Aha. If you look at the right hemisphere, you can trace some of the pathways, some of the branches of the facial nerve, and you can see that the lower 2/3 of the face are innervated contralaterally. And in contrast, the upper portion of the face around the forehead is more bilaterally innervated. So at least emotion tends to come out faster and stronger on the bottom 2/3 of our faces on the left side. Good. And so it's thought that because of this, when we are aiming to express an emotion, we have this unconscious preference to emphasize our emotional left cheek. And a study that just came out this year from Okubo and colleagues, or Okubo and Oyama, once again looked at the left cheek bias. They found a left cheek posing bias when participants were asked to pretend that they were posing for a family portrait. And they found that there was no emphasis of a cheek bias when they were asked to pretend that, or to hide an emotion or pretend that they were scientists. And more than that, they also found that they probed it afterwards. Why did you pose that way? And they gave them a list of potential options. And most people just, they didn't know why. It is truly something we don't know why we do it. We just do it. And likewise, it's been thought that there's no cheek emphasis, as I've already briefly mentioned, when we're hiding an emotion or in cases where it's less acceptable to show emotions. So I was going to say the classical example of the idea that left cheek portraits tended to be more prevalent in females than in males. But if you saw Oda's poster, we see that that's not actually the case. Another example might actually be another political study by Dirksen and Elias, who, if they went along with the stereotypical idea, so they showed participants portraits of left cheek and right cheek poses and asked them which ones are more looking liberal and which ones are looking more conservative. Their stereotypical idea is that you're a bleeding heart liberal, you're more emotional, and they happened to be the ones, the left cheek poses happened to be the ones labeled to be, thought to be more liberal than the other ones. So this suggests that there might be a learned component, a social stereotypical component to this bias as well. And a study by Lindell and colleagues in 2017, they looked at this both posing bias, the expressions, but also the perception of left cheek bias in children. And they did find that this preference for left cheek poses did come out by the age of 7, but by the age of 7, there's not yet a bias in terms of actually posing and positioning. So that must mean that this left cheek bias that the rest of the literature is seeing comes out with learning at some point after the age of 7. When? Not sure yet, something I'm hoping to find out. Now, the other aspect of my talk is bringing autism into the picture. So autism, generally speaking, is thought to be associated with a reduced laterality in autism, just across the board. Specific to emotion processing, in terms of perception of emotion, there is thought with autism to be reduced right hemisphere laterality, especially for disgust, fear, sadness, and surprise. But when compared to neurotypical individuals, there tends to be no difference in recognition or I guess laterality scores on a chimeric faces task for happiness and angry, which I thought was interesting because those are stereotypically thought of as the approach emotions, which are potentially processed by the left hemisphere, whereas disgust, fear, sadness, surprise is more of a right hemisphere process. How about expressions? This is what we're focusing on today. There's a lot less literature looking at differences in expressivity in autistic samples, but there is thought to be reductions in the quality of facial expressions and the timing in which autistic individuals make facial responses to everyday situations. Intensity of facial expressions, however, tends to be more pronounced in autistic individuals, at least compared to neurotypical samples. And also what might be relevant, and this will come up again a little later, is that it's thought that in autistic individuals, facial expressions may not carry the same type of communicative intent that neurotypical individuals use. And we'll come back to that in a moment. I also want to mention, I refer to the group as autistic rather than people with autism. Yes, usually in psychology, we prefer person first language, but the autistic community has come to mostly a consensus that autistic is the preferred term. So autism in the left cheek. There's one study by Harris and Lindell where they measured autistic traits using the autism quotient. And they also looked at posing biases in an undergraduate sample. So the scores that they had on the AQ were subclinical. They didn't reach any sort of clinical threshold for autism. And they didn't really find any differences in terms of how people high versus low on the measure scored. And they did a median split on that. So they found a left cheek bias for emotional expression. regardless of high or low AQ. And they also found that left cheek poses were perceived as more emotional, more happy. And happiness was the emotion used both for expression and perception in this study. So there's no research yet on individuals who are actually autistic and if the left cheek bias might differ in this sample. So to recap, we know that the left cheek bias is associated with laterality. We also see some evidence that it's associated with unconscious communication of, social emotional signals. And both of these aspects are different in autistic individuals as compared to neurotypical individuals. So it would make sense to predict that autistic individuals will show a reduction or even an absence of that left cheek posing bias that you see in a neurotypical sample. So that's one aspect of a larger study that I'm looking at. And I'm also have noticed that the vast majority of left cheek bias research is done with happiness and positive emotions. So I also want to know what happens when you're trying to express a negative emotion. Is it also showing a left cheek bias? So the larger study that I'm running is looking at from children age 8 all the way up to as old as I can find my participants from both a neurotypical and an autistic sample. And they completed a series of different tasks. And you can see the different tasks on the slide here. I've also broken it down into 3 different sessions because we don't want to overwhelm our autistic participants. We want to give them a break in between. And specifically today, the very small thing I'm going to be focusing on is the photograph task, the emotion expression task that they did in this study. And again, it's adults only that we'll be looking at. We're not looking at our children and adolescent samples here. So as you can see, very small amount of data at the moment. Data collection is going hard and fast, and I suspect there's more data now a few days later, but I ran out of time to add in more data, right? So we're going to look at the 32 participants who I've been looking at so far. So we have 13 autistic, 19 neurotypical individuals who we're going to be comparing here. And you can see with their EHI scores, the autistic sample, so I should also mention everybody is right-handed in this sample. Maybe in a future study, it would be interesting to open it up to right-handers and also maybe develop some of the profiles of different patterns of laterality for different tasks, but that's a next step. But anyways, you can see that the EHI score is much lower in autistic individuals than neurotypical individuals. So what did they actually do? Well, we gave them a set of instructions, and I should also mention this was completed online. Again, thank you, COVID. So we gave them some pretty in-depth instructions on how to set up their space, how to set up a chair and a camera, and how to get the environment set up properly. And they held up a sign so we knew that the photographs weren't mirror reversed. And then here's some snippets of the instructions that we gave them. So there were 3 conditions. In the good condition, we had them think about a prize that you want to win. Okay, and now pretend that you just won that prize and pose for a photograph showing how happy you are to win that prize. Similarly for bad, which is technically a sad condition, think about something that you own, that you love, and then pretend you just lost it forever. Take a photo that shows how sad you are. Then for the emotion absent or the neutral condition, pretend that you're waiting at a bus stop and you don't want to show any emotion at all. Take a photo that shows how you look while you're just waiting at the bus stop with no emotion. So then they took their photographs, they uploaded it to our website where we're collecting our data. And what we did was essentially code the photographs in terms of how are they positioned. I should also mention part of the instructions were that they weren't to face the camera like straight on, but otherwise they could position themselves however they felt comfortable. And so then we coded it in terms of left versus right cheek poses. Left cheek poses typically were coded as a -1, right cheek poses as a +1, in keeping with the tradition of left versus right laterality. And in terms of results, keeping it pretty simple right now, first of all, I'll talk about some chi-squares. We're looking at associations between whether an autistic or a neurotypical participants show a left or a right cheek bias. And in this figure here, you can see Well, first of all, this is showing the percentage of participants who showed a bias, a particular posing bias. And if you look at the blue bars indicate a left cheek bias, the green bars indicate a right cheek pose. And these are just the inverse of each other, because if you're not posing with a left cheek pose, it has to be a right cheek pose. It's all there, however, just so we can get a nice look at the picture. I'll also point out that the lighter colored bars are for our autistic group and the darker colored bars are for our neurotypical group. So looking at the good condition, at the moment with our 32 participants, there's no significant association coming out. However, for the bad condition, we can see that there is an association between the group and the cheek that's being shown. And in particular, if you look at our neurotypical group, you can see that they're more often than not doing a left cheek pose, as we would expect for the bad condition. So about 80% as opposed to the other 20% who are therefore showing the right cheek. But if you look at our two light colored bars for our autistic sample, you can see it's maybe 45 left, 55 right. So it's a much less marked difference between the groups. And in terms of the neutral condition, another thing I forgot to mention is I would have expected here to see a right cheek bias come out in our neurotypical sample, because you're supposed to be hiding your emotion, turning away your left cheek and therefore presenting the right cheek. But well, first of all, it's not statistically significant, but the pattern is actually looking fairly similar to what we see for the bad condition. So that's not what I've been expecting to see so far. I have thoughts about that. We'll come back to that. I also ran some one sample t-tests, just simple tests, to see if any of these biases are significant. So again, left cheek poses are a negative, right cheek poses are positive. A score of 0 would indicate there's no bias. And we can see for our neurotypical sample, they are showing a left cheek bias for both the bad and the neutral conditions, which again, why a left cheek bias for neutral? I was not expecting that. Interestingly, though, for our autistic sample, there is no particular bias that's coming out yet. Kind of like what I would have expected. So, thinking about the one sample t-test results first, in some we're seeing these left cheek biases in the neurotypical group at the moment for our bad and our neutral conditions. So first of all, I'm trying to figure out, well, of course, we're collecting more data. That could be one giant missing picture of the puzzle, is we need more data. But there may also be something to do with order effects that I didn't think about until I saw this data. We gave the instructions to participants in the same way. It's just a packet of instructions that they have, and the instructions go from good to bad to neutral. So maybe they are just basing their neutral pose on the pose that they had just completed, which would have been the bad pose. So this suggests maybe I need to do a little bit of counterbalancing in the online study here. Also, no bias is coming through yet for the good condition, which I thought was interesting because the vast majority of the literature finds this left cheek bias for positive happiness. Could again be a sample size or power issue. We'll find out in 2 years' time when I come back with more about this. May suggest, if this continues, then it may suggest maybe there's something to do with valence or arousal. I can't distinguish between the two because I don't have a more aggressive condition here, which would allow me to distinguish between them. But again, that wouldn't really fit with the rest of the literature, which again shows this left cheek, presumably right hemisphere advantage for positive. Food for thought. Also, with the one sample t-test, didn't find a cheek bias for the autistic group in any condition, which is what I would have expected. It does contrast with Harrison Lindell's findings, but again, that was a non-clinical sample. It was an undergraduate sample that they looked at. So to me, this suggests that the left cheek bias might be a social cue that's really only used by a neurotypical population. And it's something that may just go over the heads of non-neurotypical individuals. And now, in terms of the chi-square analysis, we found a difference in posing in, there was an association between the autistic and neurotypical groups and the left and right cheek poses, specifically for that SAD condition. And this to me gives a really nice example of how neurotypical individuals are detecting and using emotion cues differently from an autistic sample. And this relates to a newer theory in autism research known as the double empathy problem. And the basic idea here is that the individuals who have very different upbringings and very different experiences in the world may have different difficulties in understanding each other. And in this case, it suggests that when there's a neurotype mismatch, so when neurotypical individuals and autistic individuals try to communicate, there's difficulty in understanding. And the left cheek bias might be one of those things that's contributing to this double empathy problem. And what's interesting, as and maybe an aside, is with this double empathy problem, we see facilitated communication on both ends. So there's facilitated communication from neurotypical to neurotypical. Maybe the left cheek bias helps with some aspect of that in terms of emotional communication, but also within autistic individuals, you tend to see facilitated communications within the group. It's just when there's cross-group communication where some of these difficulties may arise. So the left cheek bias might be a small part of those differences, and it just might be one of those things that we inherently pick up on that autistic individuals and perhaps other non-neurotypical individuals might not be picking up on. Now, yes, I am still collecting data, as you know. For various reasons, I don't have very good access to a participant pool or anything like that. So if you would like, no pressure, I would appreciate if you would perhaps retweet if you see me tweeting about this study. You yourself probably shouldn't participate. You know all about laterality and biases and how I might predict you would be posing, so you probably shouldn't participate. But if you know anybody who might be interested, please feel free to spread the word. My Twitter details are available here. You can also go to interested.questionpro.com to just get a nice write-up about what we're looking for that you can share. So thank you very much.
So, okay, now we're here. Because I carry the microphone, I always have the chance to ask the first question. This is so stupid that I almost don't dare asking it. But the left cheek bias, could this also be a right turning bias, a right head turn bias? That means that when I ask you to show something, you just turn right because you turn right, not because you want to show your left cheek. Somebody must have suggested that and looked at that. Mike.
So first of all, is the literature usually showing that there is a right turning bias? So if you blindfold someone and they wander, is it to the right that they tend to go?
Sebastian.
I think. I can't recall now.
Yes.
So I don't know if that's been looked at as an explanation per se, but the fact that we see it change based on social expectations, whether someone is a politician or not, or whether someone wants to pose as a scientist, being very stoic, as opposed to someone posing for family portraits where it's very emotive and they're therefore turning the cheek, suggests that there's a little bit more to it than that.
Fair argument. I think one could just also ask participants, you know, when they sit down, oh, can you please turn to one side and then see wherever they turn. Okay, but there are more questions.
Thank you very much, Bianca. That was lovely.
Thank you.
Quick question about your method. So I wasn't quite clear who is taking the picture in the description. And the reason that matters, of course, we tend to think of these posing biases as just driven by the person in the image, but there are usually two people, unless it's a selfie, and even an image selection process sometimes that happens after taking a bunch of pictures, where people will choose the one they prefer. So I'm worried that the bias could be introduced at some later stage other than just posing if there are multiple images. So could you tell us a little more about how the images were taken? Who is taking the image?
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. So previously, the idea was that we would be the ones taking the image, but we had to adapt to an online measure. And this actually isn't something I've thought too much about. So thank you for bringing this up. So the instructions were that they were to set up their phone and use a timer to take a photograph. So they're not using one arm or the other. They are sitting distanced. But you're right in that they could be doing a self-selection process and taking pictures like this and pictures like this and just choosing which one they tend to prefer. So another reason why I'm excited to talk about this data here is because this whole project is a pilot study. We ultimately hope to have data from about 250 people, but that's across multiple age groups, both autistic and neurotypical. So that's definitely a consideration. Hopefully we can, in a future study, do it in person again so that we can control for those sorts of considerations. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Bianca. That was really interesting. And look, yeah, I think it was the head turning stuff. It's maybe arises when infants are first born, and owner Gunturkin suggested it as people might remember he published that paper shamelessly on Valentine's Day in Nature about kissing. But no, what is because actually I think it's what Lauren was talking about is really interesting in that it could be self-selection, but I think that's interesting in itself. Just imagine taking a couple of photographs of yourself and thinking, that's the one. So, and that's because you did find biases, of course, so that would be interesting. And that thing makes me think, are you planning to then look at those images and maybe get people to rate them, and you could perhaps include them as a covariate? So, you know, they may well be better poses showing, you know, sorrow versus happiness or whatever. But then you get people to rate them and look at those scores and perhaps enter them in and take them into account in some sort of covariate analysis.
Mm-hmm. One thing that we want to do within our research team, at least, so I should mention with the photographs that are being collected for ethical reasons, we can't share them out with our research group. There's a Scottish word that has entered my lexicon that I caught myself just using now. Anyways, totally sidetracked from that. I'm so sorry, I've forgotten what we were talking about. Right. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So one thing that we want to do is at least bring someone aboard who has FACS training, facial action coding system training, and at least see in the photographs that are submitted, how well are they expressing the emotions according to those guidelines. But at least for these photographs, we wouldn't be able to put them out into another study and have other people rate them just for ethical reasons, unfortunately. Yeah. Especially with photos of, you know, vulnerable populations and children, we're being very careful in terms of confidentiality.
Thank you, Bianca. Very, very interesting. My question is more about emotion and face perception rather than emotion expression. But there is this paper showing like this left gaze bias that we and other species have when we look at faces. But if we have the left gaze bias, it means we look at the right side of the face. But if it is the left one, the one that is more expressive, we should look at the left one. So do you have any comment on that? I always wonder whether that's the case.
Yeah, so I think that part of the idea with the emotion aspect of this is that if we do look more to the left side of faces, which is actually the right side, right? And so if we want to express emotions more, we need to be doing something to get that emotional left side out. And in addition, if we are focusing more on the left side of space, on the left side of someone's face, and their face is tilted to show the left cheek, if you're looking to the left side, that would mean that more of the face is in your right visual. No, wait, am I mixing up my lefts and rights here? In your, that wouldn't work though. In your right visual field, am I mixing up? No, in your right visual field, which would go to your left hemisphere. So never mind, that's not working out how I thought it would. It would work out. Yeah, thank you. I have very strong left-right confusion, so thank you. Yes, thank you. That's what I'm trying to get across. I appreciate it. Thank you, Sandra.
Hi, Jilly here.
Hello, hi.
Oh, and I can tell you just, anecdotal data from watching everybody on stage. Everybody prefers to look at that side of the room.
Nobody looks at the
Nobody looks at us
moderators.
over here. We all know that. That really interesting talk. One of the things that we found when doing cradling studies, when you have binary choices, is that it's very difficult to have several trials because the second trial is always influenced by the first trial. So independent group design is one way to avoid this issue. Obviously, it requires more participants, but it's something to think about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In a follow-up study, potentially. For now, I think at the least I need to go in and switch around my instructions to counterbalance a little bit here. But yes, that would be a good path to follow. Also, anecdotally, I noticed that the photograph that Martina showed of Sebastian, you were showing your left cheek in that photo earlier this morning. So random observation. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.